Is budget day at 2 p.m. Treasurer Cameron Dick will stand up in Parliament and spruik this budget as the best ever, all the while handing this state a $3 billion deficit. They were promising a small surplus, but that's all changed now because we've got an election to try and win in October. Not hard to see why we're in deficit. There's enough election sweeteners already in this budget to make the whole of Queensland diabetic, a fair income. But how bad is it? How good is it? Where does it all sit? How concerned should we be about what's to come? Joining me now is the unconventional economist and founder of macro business, Leith Van Onselen. Good morning, Leith.
G'day, Bill. How are you?
Good, thank you, mate. Keen to get your thoughts on this. I've been fairly critical of it earlier this morning. It's unusual to get you on before the budget's delivered, but there's already so much that we know about already. What do you make of what's already been announced? The 50-cent fares, the slashing of the cost of car regos, raising stamp duty concessions, all those sorts of things.
Mate, I can smell the desperation in the state government's eyes. This looks like a typical sort of budget you do when you know that you are trailing in the polls massively and you're desperate to get re-elected. So you basically just hose, subsidies and handouts and all sorts of things to your voting base, hoping that they'll re-elect you. That's basically, the way it looks at the top level. But there's also an independent economist out there called Tarek Brooker who's very good. He coined the term late last year, burnout economics. And that basically describes a situation where the RBA's efforts to slow the economy via interest rates have sort of been undone by governments who are just pumping demand through these sorts of measures. And I think we have a bit of that as well. So, yeah, look, it's not a great budget. It'll be interesting to see whether or not it has a positive poll impact. But again, this is the sort of budget you get when you're desperate and you just throw money at taxpayers hoping that they'll re-elect you.
They love to spend taxpayers' money, no doubt about that. And I think most voters are seeing through that. So could it have an inflationary impact as well? We've talked about this many times before, given you mentioned interest rates and the Reserve Bank.
Yeah, look, some measures will, some measures won't. So, for example, if you make all public transport journeys 50 cents and you cut vehicle regos by 20%, which I understand is the plan, the impact on inflation is actually a little bit mixed. So, obviously, if you reduce prices directly, that's going to be disinflationary. And so similarly, to look at it the other way, if you imagine that the state government doubled public transport fares or doubled registration in a year, well, that's obviously going to push up inflation.
Yeah,
because you're pushing up prices directly. So they're doing the opposite there. So that'll at least mechanically have a slight dampening of inflation. Not a lot. It's going not the margin. Then obviously people have more money to spend, so they'll spend some of that elsewhere, which will have a second round inflationary impact. But some of the other measures, like for example the fair play vouchers, that'll increase demand and spending by households, and also the first homeowner concession increase to $800,000 will obviously be inflationary for house prices, and also arguably construction if some of that feeds into construction prices and things like that. So whether or not it's inflationary, those sorts of measures is a bit debatable. It's certainly not good politics. It's going to push you into deficit. Probably the bigger factor there that really caught my eye and got me a little bit worried was reading about the fact that the state government wants to increase spending on so-called renewable energy and jobs to $26 billion from $19 billion last state budget. Now that's a massive increase, and I do wonder where is that money going. It sounds a little bit like Albo's, Future Australia Fund, whereby they're just going to pick a handful of so-called renewable energy projects, which will probably be of spurious value, and just throw money at them. And that there, I think, is where you're going to get the bigger sorts of inflationary impacts, just throwing huge amounts, billions of dollars into the economy, into areas that are probably going to be low productivity and not a good use of taxpayers' spending. And that's those sorts.
It's a bit of a bottomless pit, isn't it, that area?
It is. Absolutely it is. And I think I spoke to you about a month ago that a better solution to this would be just to deliver cheap energy by, controlling the gas market, for example. And then that way your manufacturing would become competitive because you'd suddenly have low-cost energy, which is one of the key cost inputs for businesses. But instead of doing that, both the federal and state government in this case look like they're just going to try and subsidise their pet programs in so-called renewable energy areas, which is going to waste a hell of a lot of taxpayer funding. It's probably going to end up being very inefficient. They're going to be areas where Australia would never be competitive anyway. Instead of fixing the source, which is that we've got some of the world's most expensive energy prices, despite the fact that we're massive exporters of coal and gas and things like that, where we should really have the cheapest energy prices in the world.
This was one of my big criticisms of this budget, that there's no long-term, looking at the root cause of these things to improve that power pricing longer term, to bring them down. We'll get $1,000 power bill relief. That'll last for 1 quarter. Then we're back to square one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said to you on a previous show that it is absolutely insane that Queensland, which literally is one of the world's biggest exporters of natural gas through Gladstone, and also one of the biggest coal exporters, Queenslanders pay incredibly high energy prices. I mean, obviously some of that's been offset with the subsidies, but that to me just makes no sense. Because can you imagine a Middle Eastern country paying $2 a litre for their petrol?
Yeah,
export the majority of their oil overseas. That's effectively what Australia's doing on the East Coast, and Queenslanders are getting hit, particularly hard, given that you are a major exporter of that stuff.
On the deficit side of things, we're now looking at $3 billion deficit 24-25, and there was supposed to be a surplus, the second largest in a decade, the largest outside of COVID. Is that a concern, given that we were coming off, I think, over $13 billion raked in from coal royalties, and now we're going to have a deficit?
Yeah, it is, and especially given the stage of the cycle. So obviously, we've got very high commodity prices right now globally, and I mean they've obviously come off a bit since the war in Ukraine and Russia, but they're still historically high. And when you have those historically high prices, you should be reining in the money. You should have huge surpluses, and instead, the government's going to deliver deficits, and then when we inevitably will get a commodity price downturn at some point, well, then the state budget's going to be further in the red. So, yeah, look, it's not particularly smart. And again, it gets back to this sort of burnout economics that economist Tariq Brooker talks about, whereby the state governments are running these big deficits, which is pushing money into the economy. At the same time as the Reserve Bank of Australia is trying to slow the economy by hiking interest rates. So we've got this, one foot's planted on the brake by the RBA, and the other foot's planted on the accelerator by governments. And that's just, creating this crazy situation whereby inflation is going to end up being higher than it needs to be. And interest rates are going to end up being higher than they need to be.
The opposition has already agreed to support everything in the budget, despite not having seen it yet. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. That happened last week. Does that make economic sense to do that?
No, absolutely not. Look, I mean, the opposition's so far ahead in the polls that they probably don't need to do much. And I think maybe they're just being tactical.
Small target, yeah.
Yeah, small target. Like, they think if they don't make too much noise, they'll get voted in. But look, it's not very sensible. I mean, you don't really want to encourage these sorts of budgets. So I think they should be at least pushing back. But to me, it doesn't. We don't really know what the opposition stands for either, and we could just have another situation like we've had federally in Victoria and everywhere else, whereby a new government comes in and nothing much really changes. It's like switching Pepsi for Coke.
I've said, I don't know whether it's fair or not. I'll ask you the question. I think it's a reckless budget. I don't think it's got any long-term reform in it, and I don't think it's a responsible budget. How do you sum it up?
Yeah, I think you've summed it up perfectly. It's just a short-term, election buy-in budget, whereby they're just trying to buy votes to try and, get back in some, miraculously. Let's face it. And if they don't get in, they're going to leave a time bomb for the next government to fix up, because the next government's going to have to deal with the bigger deficit. So, look, I'm sure there's some tactics there. They think, look, we can buy some votes, maybe minimise the election damage if we don't get elected in.
Save the furniture. The house is gone.
Yeah, that's it. And then if we don't get elected in, we hopefully minimise the damage, and then the next government's got to clean up our mess, which makes them look worse. So maybe that's the thinking behind it.
Could this have an impact on the state's credit rating as well, with the deficit that's expected?
Oh, look, I'm not sure if this level will move it, but it's certainly not going to shift the ratings agencies' thinking in a positive light. They prefer it to go the other way. I don't think this on its own would necessarily get your ratings downgrade, but it definitely wouldn't move you towards an improvement. It'd be seen as negative. I just not sure if it's quite bad enough yet. But if you got a series of budgets like this, you probably would get a downgrade.
All right, great to get your insight again, as always. Thanks for your time, Leith.
Yeah, cheers, Bill. Speak to you next time.
Yeah, we will do. Unconventional economist and founder of Macro Business, Leith Van Onselen. He agrees with me there about summing up this budget. What do you think about what he had to say?